3 months ago, chains started dying. Whether that's voluntary or involuntary, somebody else will just like come along and like build like the L2 that like embodies all the same principles, and like that hasn't happened, you know, much more than I would have liked to think, right? L2 with a centralized sequencer, like, is that valuable? It's not what made Ethereum valuable, right? I wanted to bridge to more than one chain at the same time. I'm doing like 5 transactions. Surely I could just do one. Testnets are the #1 source of like problematic instances. I literally just like machine gun fire sign transactions. It's network all day and they just land. You are not approaching it from the level of how most L2s are doing it today when it comes to that, and you can't sacrifice on the core kind of philosophical, and a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that, but so be it.
Okay, welcome back. Another episode of The Pipeline. We have some big fans of the EVM here. I am definitely excited for this one. We have Tom Kysar, we have Keone, we have intern, powerhouse episode. We're going to run through all things as it relates to the EVM here. And I am particularly excited for this episode. Reached out to Tom last week, and I'm not sure why, but I just assumed you were located in New York City, and you absolutely were not. I should have checked the Twitter bio. It's right there. But I just assumed that you were in New York, and I was like, oh, why don't you come by? We'll do this podcast in person. And you responded, Tom, that you were willing to fly out for this one, which is pretty incredible. So,
you know, it's for what it's worth, I'm in New York a bit, you know, and I'm from the East Coast, grew up in Connecticut. So, you know, if there's always a reason to head over. I was like, maybe it's worth the trip this week. But yeah, so I'm happy, you know, I could put it together, and thanks for reaching out, and, you know, looking forward to it.
For sure. Yeah, Tom, I feel like we've known each other for a little while, really just via crypto. Would love to get just a brief background of what you've been working on with Gas.Zip, and then, yeah, anything notable before. I know you've been building in the space for a lot longer than really anyone who's still currently here today.
Yeah, you know, well, so at least, you know, Gas.Zip today, right, is just, it was kind of a weekend project that we made maybe a year and a half ago. And we try to make it like what I wanted as a user, right? I was kind of exploring a bunch of these new chains. And it was actually built out of like the core functionality of, I wanted to bridge to more than one chain at the same time. It's like going to like ARB and OP in these places, right? And like, I'm doing like 5 transactions. Surely I could just do one and like go to these places, right? And then it took probably about 6 or 8 months before, you know, I put it on Twitter, and it's like, surely this is useful to somebody else. And now it's kind of, you know, I try to make it quite literally a tool that I find useful, right? I want to explore a bunch of these new chains. Chain launches started becoming, as I'm sure you know, right, much more common and much more frequent. I can still kind of scour online today and probably find 3 new chains to add every day if I really wanted to, right? I've kind of had to start scaling back on that a little bit, because there's just too many, right? And there's too much surface area to cover. And now we try to focus more on chains that actually have some level of like users requesting it and demand. But you know, it operates similarly to kind of how a relay link works, or how an orbiter finance works, or, you know, a very watered down version of how like an across works, with, you know, they call it intense. You know, a lot of these, us and relay and et cetera today, have a limited liquidity, or like a solver set, right? And you can open that up broader in the long run. But it essentially allows you to just do really quick and really cheap fills on these things, right? Because you're not really using this interop network with a heavy verification layer and stuff like that. It's really, you know, requesting funds on chain B, I'm willing to pay you on chain A, and essentially some market maker off chain fulfills that order for you, right? A lot of this intense stuff that we talk about today is really just kind of like a rebranded version of RFQ, right? With a market maker. But so yeah, you know, we try to build a bridge that is hopefully useful, you know, to, you know, myself and a lot of other it's kind of like a power user type thing, but at the same time, you know, it's relatively low in limits, allows us to scale and have higher surface area and stuff like that. But it results in us, you know, interacting and interfacing with pretty much every new chain that comes out today, right? And staying on top of that. And just prior to that, I mean, the bigger thing was I worked on this thing Augur for like 7 years, which was
How
great.
your time?
It was like one of these things that like I'm super happy we did, right? And like in hindsight, I'm like, oh, I felt like this was like fought the good fight. This was like principally correct. I learned a lot, right? About it was the furthest end of decentralization engineering like possible. However, in hindsight, right, doing that, particularly in the time that it was, means it's very difficult software to use for a user. And user onboarding is, and actually getting adoption is almost difficult, it's functionally impossible, right? So, while it didn't really, functionally we consider it kind of failed, it's like a product itself, right? I think a lot of the work that was done there, can be applicable and is applicable and was like worthwhile doing, particularly in kind of the Oracle research and stuff like that. And, today you have Polymarket. But Polymarket had existed without Augur, probably, but I would like to think that, it maybe helped shape what Polymarket has become today to some extent. And, so I still love prediction markets. That's kind of like, deep into my heart, but that's what I spend most of the time doing, at least.
Definitely. Well, I think your position is really cool as someone who's kicked the tires on almost every chain under the sun. Certainly, vast majority of EVM chains. You have some crazy number of chains integrated on Gas.Zip. Is it like 350 plus, Tom?
Yeah, it was 350 plus, but then, as of like 3 months ago, chains started dying like in higher amount, right? So we probably have 2 or 3 chains die a week now, whether that's voluntary or involuntary. So we're probably somewhere around like 320 or something like that. But
yeah, but particularly the perspective on the EVM landscape, I think is pretty unique, and obviously it has a lot going for it. Obviously, Keone holds affinity for the EVM, having focused on rebuilding the stack and pushing the space forward from a performance perspective over the past couple of years. But simultaneously, other chains, other VMs have absolutely grown in popularity recently. And I'm curious, what is it about the EVM that gives you this conviction and keeps your confidence unwavering?
yeah, I mean, and like, I think my perspective comes from a much more kind of like simpler, sure, there's like, technical, I think, arguments and justification to it. But I mean, the biggest thing to think about is one, just from a user and a developer, right? It's just unmatched when it comes to the ability to like functionally do things, right? We have like what at this point, like almost a decade of like precedent when it comes to open source templates, people's projects, like things, just like if you want to get in and start building something as a developer, doing that on an EVM chain is like astronomically, I don't know if easier is the right word, but there's just so much more going for it by nature of the fact that we have all of these things that have been built on the EVM over years, right? Unlike, even, I mean, Solana's gotten pretty good today, right? But even that, right? You still hear people, they go and try to like dev stuff on this and it's just like, it's a nightmare, right? And like the EVM is just, it's like, it's a million times easier and far ahead of these alt VM implementations by nature of the fact that it's just existed for so much longer, right? And on that, I have a much higher degree of confidence using these applications because I know to some extent these things are like forks of something that's existed for such a long period of time that I don't have as, significant of a concern when it comes to security and like I go and use these, like I go and use this thing on Solana. I have no idea what this is, right? I mean, I don't even think the contracts are verified on chain, right? Like I have no idea what I'm putting my money into. Is it safe? I don't know. It probably is. And it is for the most part, right? But like when I can go to a brand new EVM fork and swap on their AMM router and have like a really high degree of confidence that like this is a Uniswap V2 fork and this thing has just been like beat into submission for 7 years and I like know there's not a vulnerability here, right? So I think like all this combined, right? It allows a new chain to bootstrap at a rate that is like magnitudes faster than somebody who comes in with like a new and native, VM implementation, right? Even just the compilers are audited, right? I mean, that probably hasn't been done in a while, right? But the Solidity compiler, there's so much of the stack that is terrifying. Like when you look at it, right? For like particularly a new VM implementation and anything like EVM wise is just functionally, right? It's existed. It's it's more robust. The onboarding and using it is much better, and like it allows you as a new chain as well to, I think, bootstrap and lay out a foundation of all the infrastructure that users want much quicker, much, safer, gives everybody a much higher degree of confidence. And yeah, it's just, I think you look at, go try to use Solana versus, even today versus some new like roll up that just came out yesterday. And like, there's just the ecosystem's there and like you can use it. Is there a lot of liquidity? That's a different question. But in terms of the actual infra, I think it makes like a night and day difference for sure.
Yeah, Keone, I'm curious. I'm sure you share a lot of that sentiment, but what about the EVM really played into that initial design decision, which seems like a non-negotiable, that Monad was going to be an EVM chain, and then you're going to go tackle those performance blockers along the road, like considering that as a non-negotiable.
There's clearly value in interoperability. Like there's value in having common standards that are battle tested. When we talk to Web 2 prospective blockchain users or enterprises, it's a huge selling point for them knowing that when they use Monad, they're just using the EVM and they don't have a vendor lock-in issue. Just in general, I believe in the value of common standards because it makes everything more efficient. It allows people to coalesce around one plan, put all of their data, all of their contracts, all of their effort into a common standard, and then just know that it'll always work. So for us at the Monad team, we've just felt very strongly that it was a non-negotiable to support and improve the EVM. I also just feel like there's so much potential in our industry. There's so many talented developers, really great tooling, a lot of creativity, and a lot of sort of long-term vision about utilizing decentralized tech to improve the world and improve access to personal finance tools or access to opportunities, access to jobs that are, in another country for someone that's in a developing country that are enabled by permissionless systems and enabled by, the things that we love about blockchain, but things that have just been really constrained due to throughput and cost. And it's just a huge opportunity to make the existing system and all of the existing landscape of stuff that everyone's building better by making the underlying rails better.
And I think one point too, Tom, you hit on and Keone just expand upon, the confidence of knowing that the common standard is what's being used isn't just like a nice to have feeling from the user's standpoint. Like it actually matters a lot in how quickly an ecosystem can get bootstrapped, right? If you think about, there's this brand new chain with a new VM, if your confidence in it is basically like unknown, like you're like, I've seen tweets from this company, I probably trust the team, but it's some brand new VM. There's almost this amount of money that people talk about in crypto. They're like, this is like a punting wallet. Or like I connect to sketchy websites with this wallet because, if this gets drained, then that's okay. Whereas when it is using the EVM, I like the way that you put it, Tom, where you said like Uni V2 has basically just been beaten to death. Like every single angle has been hit on this thing. There's just a much higher confidence that it's going to do the thing that you think it's going to do. And that allows more funds to flow on chain. Liquidity is massive. I know, Tom, you said you've been at 350 chains, I guess, Gas.Zip now down to 320 because they're dying off. I'm sure liquidity is a massive factor in why these chains are no longer around and no longer exist. So yeah, having confidence in the standard, like it helps on the enterprise side for sure. But from a user standpoint, like knowing that you can trust this software and that, a vast amount of really smart people have gone and looked at it and tried to break it and it stood the test of time. It's not just a nice to have, right? It meaningfully impacts the amount of funds that will actually flow into these apps and people that are building for the EVM in general, but for Monad specifically in this case.
Yeah, I mean, this something that I, Solana, there's an argument that I would have to like have when Solana was really taking off, right? And a lot of the Solana people were like, it's like, not that big of a deal, and like, but like, the TVL on ETH is huge, right? As we all know, right? Just amount of value that's on the Ethereum chain is massive. It's the primary source of TVL that then flows everywhere else, right? And even by nature of it being non-native to like bridge into Solana, right? Like there's no canonical bridge, right? But just it was like you have to like convince these guys that have the real big value on ETH to like remit into your chain, right? And this is just like a massive uphill battle, right? And the Solana guys were like, we don't need that, right? And I think that's, not, you want to capitalize these apps and these things on chain with, amounts of liquidity that make everything useful and competitive. You need these large levels of TVL to eventually kind of make their way over to you. And, being native EVM is like a massive plus, but, by nature of, you need to convince these guys that this is like a safe and secure place for them to essentially, bridge over 10,000 ETH, 20,000 ETH, whatever it is, right? I think if you manage to convince that level of TVL to come on over, that's how you've seen a couple of these chains really win in sense of suddenly their apps are competitive with like mainnet apps in terms of like swapping prices and loans and liquidity and stuff like that, right? That's how you like really win, I think.
One of the initial reasons I was like, hey, it'd be great to talk to TK on the pod. Keone had put out a tweet right around a week ago, a little bit over a week ago, basically saying, do you have any candid feedback for the Monad Foundation? Like, let me know in the comments. And your response, I'm assuming most people listening to this haven't seen the tweet, so I'll just read it out. TK, you say, probably different feedback than most, but we've landed nearly 2 million plus transactions, and Monad is the only testnet chain we've worked on at some level of scale where the network has never behaved problematically or even inconveniently, literally. TLDR, whatever doing, network is good. 2 million transactions is a lot. What is that been like pushing through on Monad? Obviously, a lot of time and effort has gone into the testnet, so it's great to hear that it's behaving properly. But yeah, what has that experience been like?
Yeah, and I imagine it's a combination of both, the network obviously and some level of you have good infrastructure. There's the best of the infrastructure providers in the ecosystem are maintaining and supporting, right? And actually low, I don't know if they get much shout. I don't know if people even know that they do it, but Triton One runs some testnet RPCs for you guys. These things are killer, and that team is great. So we've been using some Triton One stuff along with Alchemy and some other people, right? But even when these good providers will support testnet chains, right? Almost universally, you run into something. It's testnets are the number one source of like problematic instances when within our infrastructure, right? This primarily comes from the nature of we run faucets, right? So you're running a faucet, it's just you're just firing transactions all day, right? And they have to land. One transaction screws up, kind of you have to reorder the nonces. You have a bunch of backlog, etc., stuff like that, right? But one, I think, just by nature of the fact that there are sometimes I'll land like 40 transactions in a block, and it's just like, whoa, like go and look, right? And it's like, holy shit, there's a lot of transactions, like it all comes in the same block number. So there's not really a backlog for it, right? But I mean, we fire at this all day, right? And I have testnets that are EVM ones as well, right? And every 100 transactions, something happens, right? And it's just like the network will respond, give you some unexpected response, right? That's just like, who knows, whatever reason. You get most of the times they're undocumented errors, right? You just get some random response and it's who knows. Or you run into, I was talking about Hype EVM earlier, right? Hype EVM, fun fact, the mempool is 8 transactions. If you send more than 8 transactions into your mempool, they just disappear. So figuring that out, right? There was a week span. We were just like, what's happening here? Where are these transactions going, right? So every EVM kind of has these weird things you got to figure out, right? Because they've changed some stuff and whatever. But generally speaking, I mean, we fire all day at this thing, and it wasn't even problematic, but it was problematic the first day by nature of, it was problematic for every infrastructure provider first day, because it was just, there was a million people trying to send 5 transactions at a time, like throughout the day, right? So it's just getting the infrastructure providers to support the scale, right? But even then, we were still landing them, and like it was just like it was like a little bit bumpy along the way. Yeah, but generally speaking, it's like I like forget that it's running in our infrastructure, which is like a big thing because I mean most of these things are just you have to sit there and kind of babysit. I gotta reset the noms. You have to like rebroadcast the backlog of transactions, whatever. So I don't. Let's just the best thing I could say is like I forget it's there most of the time, which is like and it's our number one like throughputed by number of transaction chain like for sure all day. So it's probably the infrastructure providers you have are great, right? But the chain itself, it's just like I wish I knew the actual technical reason, right? For like why is this like? But like I never have a problem with nonce management. I never have transactions that hag or lag or like drop off or hang. I never have to rebroadcast anything. Like it just works. I just like fire at this thing all. We have no sophisticated like batching thing and like retrying or anything like that. It's just like I literally just like machine gun fire sign transactions this network all day and they just land. That's the best I can say about it, right?
I'm actually curious to hear Keone's perspective on that, probably having a pretty unique look behind the scenes at what engineers. Right? Yeah, like how does that come to be? And like what also was was this like a non-negotiable for testnet? Because to Tom's point, like this is not typically how a testnet looks.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, that's awesome to hear, and the team will continue to make the testnet more performant as well, because right now the gas limit is 300 million gas per second, and we'll just keep stepping up the limit to about 1 billion gas per second. But I think it's really just the result of optimizing all parts of the stack, testing a lot during the development process with spamming the network with tons and tons and tons of activity of different types of transactions and with different traffic patterns sending to different RPCs and so on. I also just think that the scale of activity on Mania testnet has stressed the system a lot, which was just good for inspiring further improvements. Like the February 19th was when the testnet launched, and we're now a couple of months after that, and can definitely say that every week and every month at least for the first like 7 or 8 weeks, there were improvements rolling out to the RPC to make things more stable. And there's just a lot of activity. There's a lot of users. There's also a lot of botting for sure.
Sure.
But we actually, we find that helpful in the sense that it stresses network and proves out the thesis.
I actually want to go back to something that Tom said at the very beginning, which is basically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is what I heard. When you're working on Augur, it was basically impossible for the common user to access, right? And I'm wondering what has changed over the past few years in terms of making the EVM more usable and also more developer friendly. But as an extension of that as well, like what other performance improvements or what other improvements to the developer or user experience need to be made for the EVM to get to a very desirable state?
Yeah, on a base level, actually, the more like most uninteresting thing, but thing that probably had the biggest impact on, I think, apps going to like the next level of where we kind of are today is indexers. We didn't have indexers. So a lot of these early apps, you ran your own indexer. Like part of running the app was sync the chain and like build an index locally of all events related to the application that you're now trying to run, which sounds like it works, right? Until that index gets quite large and suddenly it takes 3 days to sync this if you're like an end user, right? But infrastructure in a broad stroke, right? The RPCs have gotten much better, right? These RPC providers know how to handle a bunch of these, edge cases and kind of just state of reality much better than they did back then as well. Much more reliable. Like infrastructure was like a very big thing, right? Even, to some extent of like, depending on how you want to host your front ends, right? Today, a lot of people host their front ends centrally, right? But even if you don't want to, right? IPFS, the accessibility of things like IPFS is much broader today, right? There's these like kind of pinning services and things like that. If you wish to, host your stuff that way, like even the Uniswap UI, right? People hit it through the central place, but it's technically pinned, and the raw build is hosted through IPFS still, right? So like if you wanted to build actually something decentralized, right? A lot of these infrastructure pieces have come a long way where you no longer really have to like, go about it the long way, right? You can use these like kind of public subgraph type, things that would allow you to index and et cetera today. But the infrastructure was really bad. Onboarding was still quite poor. We had MetaMask, right? MetaMask is good, right? I think there's some complaints still, with kind of MetaMask as like a user-facing wallet, right? Actually, I think this is probably one of the things that there's still a lot of room for growth and improvement, is like just the wallet experience. I think Ravi's done a really good job at this to some extent, and over the last 6 to 8 months, we've seen a shift, at least from people who connect to our website. It used to be about 70% MetaMask, 30% like miscellaneous. Today, it's about 40% MetaMask and like 30% Ravi, 35% Ravi. So you're seeing like Ravi, and you're actually seeing a lot of OKX wallet market share. I think international, market like uses a lot of that. And the OKX wallet takes a very kind of like almost aggressive expansion approach, kind of similarly to we do, right? And supports a lot of the new kind of edgier type stuff. But I think wallet and like onboarding type of stuff still has, room for like making, like I still think there's like a next step it could go in terms of this thing is like much more performant, much easier. Like I still have problems with every wallet, right? As I'm sure everyone does. But generally speaking, like infrastructure is really good now for the most part. And like you want to build something, it's not easy today, right? But it's magnitudes easier than it was even 2 years ago, right? Like try to build something today in comparison to where you were 2 years ago. The amount of just services and tooling and stuff that is out there, accessible for you to use is like insane, right? And the fact that you can go to somewhere and they have just like a synced indexer like ready for you in like 2 clicks is like, oh wow. And like you can query all this, right? You can go build a block explorer if you want. You can go do whatever. So yeah, I think that as of recent, it's just infrastructure is wild. The amount of services that people offer in terms to access this data and access these networks is like really comprehensive. You have lots of choices, right? We have 25 different kind of RPC providers today, right? Whereas before there's maybe 2 or 3 and you kind of had to pray and hope and beg that they would support whatever network you want. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of used to have to roll it all yourself, right? And today it's a lot of, there are people and you can click the button 3 times and you have any infrastructure you need, right? It enables, I think, a lot, not only quicker, but it allows, it's like how we've started seeing, I think, like a lot of these kind of like actual new and interesting like stuff starting to get rolled just by nature of the learning curve to get in is in the like the cost curve of getting in is getting lower and lower and lower by the day, right? And that's like a big thing, at least from you want to come in and spend your time and energy and resources trying to build something more or less.
Yeah, one of the threads when you were talking about building essentially in crypto, or one of the threads that I pulled from it was a while ago specifically, like building in a decentralized manner was much harder, right? There's just so much stuff that you have to account for, and like if you centralize some areas of it, it makes it easier, like you can move faster. But like Augur was like truly like maybe the epitome of the decentralized. Yeah, that's like the most extreme place on the spectrum of choosing decentralization, and it's just much harder. And we see some parallels to that today in chain trade-off choices. Like a few different, there's just like trade-offs all around crypto, right? Between decentralization and centralization, like where is it actually important? Where is it not important? And you can, optimize, use a centralized method to get a better user experience, but it doesn't kind of maintain the decentralized ethos. Question for you, Keone, in that same vein. From the jump, like from the initial time Monad was talked about in any serious manner, decentralization has been like the core ethos, right? It's like there isn't actually a point to doing this if it's not actually a globally decentralized layer one network. And a crazy amount of engineering and manpower has gone into actually building it that way. I know if someone has listened to the pipeline before, they may be familiar with their thoughts on this, but would love to hear like how important was decentralization to the initial ethos of Monad, and then like staying true to it this entire time? Like what's the main driving force? Like why is decentralization actually important for what Monad is trying to bring to market?
Well, first of all, I think it's just very fun. I think that it's challenging to build decentralized systems, whether that's the at the chain level or at the application level. It is more challenging to build in a decentralized manner, but there's a huge amount of value that comes from building in this incredibly neutral, censorship-resistant, decentralized manner. And I think the challenge attracts people that, that want to work on challenging things and want to expand their brains. So I would say even just from that perspective, it's been really rewarding to see growth of decentralized apps. And we're just still at the very, it feels like so early still in terms of what we can see built over the next couple of years. The second reason is really that I think we have a lot of asset silos in the world. Most assets are being tracked within centralized databases, within individual banks or individual governments. And there's friction in moving from one silo to another. And the friction manifests in the form of delays, whether that's a settlement delay, coordination. Sometimes two silos are not directly connected to each other, so they need to go through a third silo in order to get there, which is what people experience when they're trying to make cross-border payments between two countries that often have to hop through a third middleman bank. There's all these frictions, and then the frictions are also manifest in terms of cost, because if you maintain a centralized asset ledger, you have control of the inflow and outflow, and you can charge people to go in and out of it. We especially see this in more emerging nations where it's very expensive to bank, where they're just arbitrarily high fees or they're high capital controls. And it ultimately is a destimulant on growth of that economy and advancement for people that are in those countries. So I think at a basic level, there's these asset silos, and I think a lot of us in the crypto space want to see these silos get busted. We want to see data get pushed down to a common layer where everything can interoperate, where there's freedom of movement between different people or different companies. But in order for that to happen, we need something that is actually incredibly neutral. Like, it doesn't work for just one of those silos to expand and subsume all the other ones. The other silo maintainers won't agree to it. So we do need something that is actually credibly neutral. And we say that phrase a lot, but I think it's just very clear when you think about coordination of different entities at the government level or at the big bank level. So we need this base layer for commerce and finance to transfer through, and we need something that could scale to the level of world adoption in order for that to be possible. And I think Ethereum sort of laid out this blueprint of what's possible. Bitcoin even before that. These are great visions, and it's extremely inspiring to work toward them. And I just think that what has been needed has been some technology improvements, whether that's on execution or consensus or so on. And that's something that's extremely motivating to me to see happen, as just the growth of this vision through new technology.
I was like, there's been a lot of debate on L2 specifically about like not upgrading to the decentralized sequencer.
Yeah, I kind of just, what are you saying, right? Is the thing I'm a long-term ETH maximalist, right? And like, I think the kind of thought that I've more, boiled and concreted down to of how I would like to see, like, there's a world where I would like to see Ethereum arguably like ossify as quickly as possible, like stop. And this is like a kind of a somewhat, in the same way kind of Bitcoin is today, right? Like Bitcoin is like very reluctant to change and reluctant to, being poked at anymore. And that's like good because we know Bitcoin is this censorship resistant kind of financial layer rails of the world that will always behave in the way that we think it's going to behave. And I would like Ethereum to come that way, right? Now, the downside to that is obviously then Ethereum stays at the kind of, technical throughput and scale and et cetera levels that we see today, right? Which we all know is, not of the requirements of if you want to build, high throughput, not even high throughput things, moderate throughput things, right? Like it's somewhat slow and it's somewhat expensive. But I would go from my kind of ETH maxi POV, it's like, that's what I'm okay with, right? Like I'm okay with Ethereum being at those levels because it'll allow anybody in the world to submit their transactions and land them as long as they're willing to pay for them, right? And we can reliably do that. And now you would think that it's like, okay, somebody else will just like come along and like build like the L2 that like embodies all the same principles and like and like that hasn't happened in a broad, much more than I would have liked to think, right? It's like the answer to that in a broad stroke was kind of like the bases and the OPs and the arbitrums came along, right? And like, sure, like Arbitrum and OP are like working on these things, right? But it's just like, yeah, I think this takes people who come in where they're like, we understand what made Ethereum valuable, and you don't sacrifice and compromise on a bunch of those core principles of like what made ETH valuable as a chain. And exactly kind of that. It's like I think you have to come from a POV of just like, this takes like a tech stack improvement. And if you take it from that line without sacrificing the principles that made ETH, I think, valuable, right? Because I think a lot of these people, I think we'll come to find out in the future that like, yeah, L2 with a centralized sequencer, like, is that valuable, right? Like it's not what made Ethereum valuable, right? So yeah, I'm interested in this type of stuff because it's like, okay, I think everyone agrees the tech stack of ETH can be, or I don't know, can be, but should be continuously attempted to be improved and worked on, right? It's just the vast majority of people who have tried to do that today have like immediately like just like, taken it out of its knees. And it's just like, well, we can obviously make it more improvement if it's just like a single sequencer. And it's just like, okay, like what are we doing here now, right? Like we've kind of just, so I'm interested in the stuff where it's more like this, where it's, you acknowledge and recognize like this is valuable because of X and Y, right? Because this is a globally available, censorship resistant, a massive kind of compute layer. How do you not sacrifice on that? And at the same time, make it so that I can land 2 million transactions, and at 50 transactions a block and, et cetera, type things like this, right? And as I'm sure you know, right, it doesn't appear that there's many people thinking about their chain in that direction, right? So that's honestly like from like a higher like philosophical type level, right? That's what I've found interesting about you guys and stuff, right? Is that I haven't like dug in for what it's worth. I'm not like haven't read I'm not super deep into the stack, right, of what you guys are doing. I know from a somewhat high and medium level, but it at least appears, right, that exactly kind of what Keone was saying, like you are not approaching it from the level of how most L2s are doing it today when it comes to that. And that's what I think. I mean, if there's a like this, I think that is a base requirement of if you want an L2 to or another chain to win and be competitive to Ethereum, right? You can't sacrifice on that core kind of philosophical and base layer that is. I think that's what made everything valuable in the long run. And a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that, but so be it.
It actually reminds me of an interesting thought that I've been having recently, which is basically like, are we as an industry focused on the right problems? And by extension, like, are we taking the right approach to the problems that crypto is facing, both on the developer side, but also the user side. And there's this like baggage that comes along with the inherent financialization of everything. And there's obviously a lot of distractions in crypto as well. And to a degree, I think those are, somewhat inevitable, but curious for both of your perspectives here. Like, are we as an industry really focused on the problems that we should be focused on?
I think some of us are. I think some of us are, right? Like, for sure, right? I think that's kind of, it's like the easy answer, right? But, and so I think some of us think we are, and a lot would then disagree that they aren't, right? Kind of the, build the easy way will shape into the hard way in the long run type things, right? Functionally, I think there's a large portion of our ecosystem that has probably strayed from the core understanding of like what they think is the correct and right problems to be solving, right? We saw kind of a split, I think, in our ecosystem at some point where a lot of people think, this X is the correct things that we all should be solving for, and suddenly we switch to, Y, Z, X, K, whatever are the things we should be solving for, right? And yeah, so not as many as I would have liked, right? But I think at some point, and it's unfortunate, right? I think at some point it takes a almost like a bad event to occur in order for people to realize and to like reposition their focus back to like, oh, like a chain is valuable because of this here, right? Like just like extreme end of that spectrum example, right? Like it's gonna take a bunch of guys that are like coining on some like weird alt L3 with, one sequencer and tie blah, for, I don't know, suddenly some country's gonna come in and like, seize the sequencer of the guy who's operating it, right? And then they're never gonna be able to withdraw their money, and there's gonna be 1,000 people on Twitter that are like, hey, like all my money's gone, I'm never gonna be able to access it again, right? And then they're gonna sit down one day and think and be like, like what made this valuable to begin with, right? Was it the fact that it was like a network I could interact with on MetaMask, or was it the fact that like I was operating on like permissionless and so like infrastructure that was resistant to the state of whatever coming in and like seizing the infrastructure and taking all my money? It's like an extreme example, right? But like it takes we had it for a while when FTX happened, right? All of a sudden FTX like made people think about like trustlessness, right? And so it's kind of a shift back and forth between there, right? But no, I mean, I think you all know, right? It's not, I don't think everybody cares necessarily about that level of stuff today as much as maybe we should.
I want to answer the question in a slightly different direction, although I definitely agree with what Tom said about trade-offs and maybe less emphasis on decentralization, less emphasis on nation state resilience and true censorship resistance. I think the thing that my mind went to when Danny, when you asked about this, is that to a certain extent, each ecosystem that's been successful has been a reaction to a previous one. So I feel like with Ethereum, there was a strong focus on decentralization and building really robust infrastructure, both at the chain level and then at the application level. And that became really powerful and inspired a lot of people. But it was also quite academic, and some of the Ethereum research directions and scaling directions were maybe seen as not as pragmatic. And then Solana came along with the mainnet in 2020 and a big rise in activity in 21, and then another one closer to end of 23 and 2024. And there was just this extreme level of pragmatism on the engineering side, sort of in some cases duct taping things together, which I think the Solana team would agree with as well. Like there's a lot of stuff that was kind of hacked together, but it was very performant. And really cheap and easy to use, and that a lot of people embraced that, and that became like Solana became kind of a selling point for trading, and specifically for speculation. And then I think maybe what I would say is some of the original sins of that, some of the culture, is the extreme focus on speculation. And I think that there's good and bad in everything. I think that the Solana Internet Capital Markets, MO, the Internet Capital Markets calling card is actually very inspiring. It is exciting to think about giving more companies access to capital that can use it efficiently. There's a lot of small businesses that, their only source of capital is a loan that's very, very high interest. And if we can actually decentralize that and give them access to global capital, they can be much more efficient and get much cheaper loans and grow their business faster and have a greater chance of success and have more economic mobility. That's extremely exciting and extremely motivating. And there's definitely a strong kernel of truth and goodness there. But then in practice, that goal then ends up getting co-opted into, let's launch a meme coin factory, and let's, anyone could launch a company this way, but, in practice, a lot of people launch non-companies that pretend to be companies, or that are associated with the person that is already running a company, but where there's no actual value accrual or linkage between the token and the actual business. And then there's just pure speculation, and then there's rug pulls and scams and so on. And yeah, I think that the next success will have to be a reaction in some sense to this kind of culture that is formed. And I would say it's about a return to quality. It's about quality assets, quality companies, quality teams that are working hard to realize a vision. And the challenging part of this is that because we live in a decentralized world, there's not just one single authority that's saying like, that is a good company, that is a scam, that is a good company, that is a scam. It's actually the community that needs to self-regulate and build up the white blood cells. And I think we'll get there. We're definitely getting more resilient to scams over time within this industry, but there are also constantly new people coming in and new scammers coming in also. So it's always a bit of push and pull.
Yeah, Keone, when you were talking, I was almost envisioning, like if you take a snapshot of any point in time over crypto's history after, I don't know, call it like the DAO hack, once there's like enough people using crypto that weren't like the core people building Ethereum, for example. If you take a snapshot, there's like 100 bullets like flying forward, and 99 of them are like spraying to the side. They might be a scam. They're not useful at all, but one of them is actually good. And over time, like the 99 spray away, and like some people lose money, some people make money, but like at any given point, it feels like most of the stuff that's happening is useless or a scam or like transferring money from one person's pocket to the other. But every time there actually are at least a few good things moving forward, and those build up over time. And that is kind of the ethos of crypto to me, right? You end up with this very powerful momentum of all the good things that build on top of each other, to the point where you have like very performant decentralized networks coming to market that like maintain the crypto ethos, but also allow for scale. But it's like you go on crypto. If you went on crypto Twitter at any point in the last 7 years, like most of the stuff you're seeing is people just calling things scams. And you're like, that's crypto. And it gets this reputation behind it. And it does. I feel like it takes a decent amount of conviction and hard work to like follow what you think is actually the good thread here. It takes a while. Like we hear this from developers that will talk to the Mono Foundation. They're like, look, I'm watching Pump Fun, and then all like now there are 3 competitors that all spun up, and it seems like they're all making money. Like, why am I working on this thing that I think is important for crypto or the decentralized ethos? But I think it's because like there are like inherent rewards and kind of like personal satisfaction to like actually adding a layer of paint to this mountain that is formed in crypto over time. But it's just funny to think that like most of the things happening that grab attention in crypto, like over pretty much crypto's entire history of having an actual user base, are these like strays that are just, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and everyone's just on the casino flywheel. But I feel like you just need to have faith that that mountain of pain is going to get one layer at a time and will grow. And like crypto, I don't know, 7 years ago, it didn't quite feel unstoppable. 2021 happened. You're like, oh, this is definitely going to stick around. Then FTX blew up and you lose a little bit of faith. And then you look at it now and I don't know, that's to me what makes it feel unstoppable, like throughout the entire industry. Daniel, I'll pass it to you. Are there any, I know we're coming up on time here, any questions you would like to throw out there?
We are coming up on time. The only question that we have yet to hit is the question that you always ask. So I'm going to throw it back to you.
I will catch it from you. Keone, this is not your first time with this question. Tom, it probably is. This question's called the final alpha. Keone, I think you've at least answered this a handful of times, but I feel like at any given point you're thinking about something new, have some new perspective. So we would love to hear from you again on this. But Tom, the final alpha was shamelessly ripped from the Up Only podcast, which a surprisingly few amount of people actually remember at this point that currently use crypto. It's just like one parting message that you would like to leave with the viewers. And it can be about anything that you think that you would like to put your name on, right? It could be a funny joke. It could be a grandma's recipe you've inherited that you love. It could be a piece of wisdom that you think might leave people, a little bit wiser for listening. It can really be kind of anything that you would like to basically be the closing remarks for the show.
I'll kind of base it onto what you were just saying before that, right? And it's hard to boil it down to, and it's hard to identify them sometimes, right? But I've come to find out that the most interesting things, and generally the things that probably have the highest chance of winning and being successful, are the ones that, in your example, where there's kind of a bunch of bullets flying everywhere and there's one down the middle, is the few people and teams that are a handful of those straight shooting bullets, right? And it's going to be in a mix of all this chaos and everything, right? And you can usually figure it out. It's just sometimes you generally don't want to necessarily. They're generally not. It's not going to be the project that makes you rich tomorrow, right? They're not like. It's not something that's going to just change your life tomorrow and airdrop $1 million into your pocket, right? But following these projects, staying on top of these projects, and nonetheless supporting them, pay you long-term dividends, and also same thing with like the ecosystem and the crypto in general, right? So it's like the hard decision to make, but if you sit and kind of look at it, you kind of know what these people and projects are, and just in hindsight, generally, aligning yourself with these types of things, I think has been the most beneficial and one of the more beneficial things you can do in crypto in general.
Beautiful. Thank you.
My final alpha is sometimes you need to eat the onion.
Straight off the Twitter timeline from today.
It's on my mind.
Love that one. Wonder if we can link the original onion in the show notes.
Oh, I think we certainly can, but I'm sure there's some viewers that are maybe not familiar with that expression. Tom looks a little confused. Keone, would you mind unpacking that a little bit for us?
Yeah, we have a habit in the Monad community of eating raw onions on live stream or in at Monad community meetups, and it's they're spicy. It's tough to eat the whole onion. Your stomach hurts a little bit afterward, but sometimes you just have to do it. And I think that it's not a great metaphor because that's always totally voluntary and just for fun. But on the other hand, frequently we just have hard problems. We just have to solve them. There's no way around them. I think with respect to asset quality and project quality and growth of the space, there's no way around it. We just have to work really, really hard. I see part of my job is just to work really, really hard to help the space improve and to have a long-term mindset and knowing that not everything is going to improve magically just through a single action, but through the compounding of many many smaller efforts that improve things slowly. I'm very optimistic.
Same here. It's certainly hard not to be optimistic after that. And after pretty great chat today on the EVM, very lucky to have had Tom, Keone, Kevin joining today. We'll have to put something together in person in the near future and revisit this one. But appreciate you all joining and hope to run it back again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, guys. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom.